Welcome to another edition of Head On here on Shaw TV, examining the issues that matter here on mid-Vancouver Island, and a little bit of a deviation to what we normally do here on the program. A very locally focused issue is typically what we examine, but now looking at something that's going on around the world and how that impacts Canadians here at home. Talking about the issue of the Islamic State extremists in Iraq, portions of Syria as well, sweeping through Iraq, the southern portions and to the east, and the impact that is having in Canada's role by getting involved with Canadian military action, threat of homegrown terror here in Canada, and also New Age terrorism. We're going to talk a little bit about the online component, how these terror organizations do their recruiting, and what kind of impact that has as well. Two very esteemed guests have joined me in studio here today. James Lunney, he's the Member of Parliament for Nanaimo, Alberni, Conservative member. James, thanks so much for making time and for coming in.
Ian, pleasure to be here today. It's a very big concern, and one, of course, the government's taking very seriously. Canadian forces over there in the arena, and I think one that, with the tragic events in Ottawa recently and in Quebec, with the loss of 2 Canadian soldiers, one that's really captured Canadians' attentions on the implications, both abroad and at home.
And Allan Warnke also in studio. He's a retired political science professor at VIU, now retired, but still keeping very close tabs on what's going on politically, provincially, nationally, and around the world. Allan, thanks so much for coming in.
Well, it's my pleasure as well, and I echo essentially what James was saying too. This is an issue that is grabbing a lot of attention of Canadians. Not very often we get this opportunity to discuss international politics, but this is relevant to the present day.
And Canada has a long tradition of being involved in peace projects around the world. There's been some combat, obviously military involvement as well, and that's what's happening now by Canada getting involved. A 6-month combat mission approved in the House of Commons, James, just last month. And let's learn a little bit more about these Islamic State extremists, the enemy at hand. Who are these individuals, and just a little backgrounder on this group of people and why it's so concerning to Canadians and abroad that there's an interjection happen here.
Well, that's a good question, Ian, a good place to start, I suppose. But you know, it is out of the Arab Spring, and the change in the whole region in terms of autocratic regimes that ruled in the area, and popular engagement, and in the whole region. Came this conflict in Syria. We saw Libya, you saw changes in Egypt, and unrest and so on throughout the area. And then, of course, with Syria, it's perplexing. We went through 3 years of a civil war there against Bashar al-Assad, and he's still there. But out of that coalition of forces that gathered to displace the regime in Syria came a new coalition of extremist elements, really the extreme elements from Al-Qaeda, and reformed under this ISIS umbrella. And in the areas where they managed to gain control in northern Syria, sweeping right across in a lightning military strike last June, right across through into Iraq, and capturing large swath of land and territory to establish their self-proclaimed Islamic Caliphate.
Now, how many of, and I'll get to you in a moment here, Allan, James, in terms of numbers, you mentioned originating primarily out of Syria. How many of these forces are from Iraq as well? And do you know what the numbers are by any chance?
Well, that's a very good question. I think there's lots of opinions on that. You can talk about 30,000 armed fighters engaged in the theater right there locally, but who knows? Because the numbers are fluid and changing, and there's ISIS flags showing up in all kinds of places, including in Israel, in some of the Israeli towns, and in the West Bank, and in Amman. So where is ISIS, and where are their influences? The numbers are really hard to pin down, but there are exceedingly wide ranges in estimates of who the fighters are. And then, of course, there are others. They're appealing to the UK, to Canada, to the United States, and throughout Europe. Throughout Europe, there are a lot of fighters from those areas have gone back to the theater to engage as well.
I think you bring a really good point there, James, about the numbers. We don't really know. It's very unknown, isn't it, Allan, to get in a number of this group, that there's a lot of mysterious sides to these Islamic extremists in terms of numbers and manpower.
Well, exactly. As James pointed out, there are all kinds of different estimates out there. The ones I sort of go by is, first of all, The Economist, I think, had a pretty good read on it. And in June of this year, they estimated about 5,000 in Syria, 6,000 in Iraq, and plus or minus or whatever. But in addition to that, since then, you've had, let's say, a recruitment. We figure at about 6,500 was recruited just in July alone, so that the CIA estimate, which was published in September, comes very close to your figure. Just from what I said from the numbers, that's about 17,000, but the CIA has said that in September we're looking at anywhere from a minimum of 20,000, possibly up to 30,000 members associated with ISIL, who are very committed to doing damage.
Allan, we've had conversations in the past about the resources and just how powerful this group is. Can you just detail for our viewers that side of things in terms of how they're financed and also armed?
Well, essentially, they've been very successful in attaining weaponry, and again, I have to rely on pretty well on CIA material here, but they've been very successful in Iraq in terms of gaining even surface-to-air missiles, access to anti-tank weaponry, including, I guess, a few Abrams tanks, and as well as some Black Hawk helicopters in Mosul Airport and that sort of thing. That's just material. That's just the surface. And so as a result, they have been able to get hold of material. They've been able to get hold of money, whether it's through extortion or holding people hostages and that sort of thing. So they have built up a cache of money as well over time. But I think the most dangerous part of ISIL, I'll call them ISIL, and ISIS got started by Washington Post, and that's fair enough, it's Iraq and Syria, but ISIL actually is in some ways more accurate because it's the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, and essentially when you start getting into that, that means ISIS has an expanding view of where their empire is going, and they do think in those terms. But most important, some of the top commanders comes right out of Saddam Hussein's bunch and the Ba'athist Party. They include intelligence officers, they include military officers, and so this is not just a bunch of guys who've taken up AK-47s and running around the desert. This is different. These are very serious individuals indeed who could do a lot of damage in the area. Plus also having some impact on neighboring Jordan. You mentioned Amman, some of the problems there already. There's recruitment in Jordan. ISIL has also taken over the one checkpoint on the border between Iraq and Jordan. In addition to that, ISIL is trying to foment support in the northern part of Saudi Arabia. This is where Saudi Arabia and Jordan, both of them say, hey, we've got to move in troops along the Iraq border. So things are happening there as well.
James, from your perspective, does the Canadian government have a grasp or understanding of the power of these Islamic extremists that Canada now engaged in combat airstrikes on with right now?
Well, I think Canada, rightly so, is extremely concerned about the impact in the area, and it is not only the largest, most vicious and effective of terrorist organizations to arrive in recent history, but they're also the best financed. They've also taken over oil fields, and where they're selling the oil is an interesting question, but they've been, reaping great rewards from selling oil in the black market, as well as they took over banks when they took over Mosul. That's a big city. And cleaned out the banks. That's a lot of money to finance a very well-financed terror organization. So, the government of Canada is rightly concerned, I think, as we talk about Amman. I think we're naive if we think that Jordan is not in their sights. And that's the gateway, of course, to Israel. And all of these people, the thing that unites them is their hatred for Israel. So, this whole cauldron has great potential well, this is the kind of stuff that causes war on a measure. We're sort of remembering just yesterday the end of wars, and we keep working towards the end of wars, but this is the kind of thing that can lead to global conflict on a scale that we don't want to consider.
And just to follow up on what James was saying, their term, as opposed to ISIL, is Daesh al-Sham, which, if you stop to think about, al-Sham actually includes Turkey, southern Turkey, it includes Jordan, it includes Palestine, Israel, it includes Lebanon. I mean, so really ISIL has in its sights the entire region, and they really want to establish an Islamic State that encompasses the entire region. Yes, starting October last year through February this year, there was a struggle here because some of the radical groups were thinking, oh, you know, ISIL has too much of a prize at the end of the day. We just want to dislodge essentially Assad out of the presidency in Syria. That's all we're at that sort of thing. But we moved on. May this year, suddenly people such as al-Zawahiri turned right around, and despite the fact that he was against al-Baghdadi at one point, who is the leader of ISIL, al-Zawahiri started thinking, you know, maybe al-Baghdadi has something here that we should pay attention to, and turned his support right around 180 degrees to support al-Baghdadi, despite the rivalry between them. So ISIL is now beginning this year, in the summer of this year, beginning to develop some support out there in the various places I've mentioned.
Of course, there's speculation, since you mentioned Bakr al-Baghdadi, that he was in fact wounded, if not killed, in a recent airstrikes by Allied forces. Yeah. So, but that leadership, there's no shortage of people willing to step forward with one more aggressive and more heinous than the one before.
That's right, because you have two leaders, deputy leaders, one in Iraq, one in Syria, and then you have two commanders I think we should keep our eyes on, as well as don't discount the major spokesman for ISIL right now as well. He's one tough cookie.
That's some alarming stuff. We'll get into the Canadian role in this conflict on the other side of the break with Allan Warnke, retired political science professor out of VIU, and also James Lunney, the Member of Parliament for Nanaimo, Alberni. Head on Shaw TV continues right after this short break. Ian Holmes back on Head On here on Shaw TV, discussing Canada's involvement against these Islamic State extremists that are causing some grave concerns in Iraq and also Syria as that group continues to widen its net. James Lunney, Nanaimo Alberni MP, and Allan Warnke, a retired VIU political science professor, are here to discuss the issue. James, let's start with Canada's role here. They've just last month agreed to a 6-month airstrike combat mission to join the U.S.-led strikes. Just explain what is Canada's contribution, what's happening there right now.
I think it's important to recognize that Canada is part of an international coalition led by the U.S., France, UK, Saudi Arabia is part of that, UAE, Denmark, and quite a number of other nations. Right. So our contribution right now is we have 6 CF-18s in the theater, with the backup support of a Polaris refueler and 2 Aurora surveillance aircraft, and about 600 personnel on the ground to help with the airstrikes. And the purpose of the airstrikes is to degrade and destroy the assets and the capabilities of the ISIS fighters. They captured a lot of U.S. military hardware, formerly from the Iraqi army when they swept over bases. And that equipment is now being used to wreak havoc. Now, we saw there were some well-publicized airstrikes, Canada's first engagement there, taking out some basically construction equipment that was used to build defensive positions. That's big bulldozers and dump trucks and earth-moving equipment that was used to divert water to flood areas in Anbar province. On the western side of Iraq, bordering up against Jordan there, to flood that and make and help advance their purposes, as well as to build defensive purposes, so defensive embankments and so on to hide their equipment. So that, you know, that kind of strike and taking out the hardware that they're using to terrorize people is the objective of the airstrikes. Will it be enough? Of course. time is going to tell as it plays out. But we're part of that international coalition working to degrade the ability of ISIL to wage that expansive campaign and try and stabilize the government in Iraq.
6-month commitment here from Canada, James. Do you envision that job getting done in that 6 months, or do you think it's going to take a little bit longer and maybe more increased involvement, perhaps boots on the ground, to try to make the real impact here?
Well, the Iraqi army is not totally dissembled. They need to be regrouped, and so that's part of the purpose of our forces on the ground. The advisors are working with the counterterrorism forces in Iraq and also with the army to help them regroup, and along with the Kurdish Peshmerga fighters that have been the most effective so far. But you know, that battle in Kobani, right on the border of Turkey, where the Kurdish fighters were valiantly trying to hold off ISIS, and so far have been successful. It was quite alarming that it looked like Kobani could fall without the Western forces engaging. You know, you have to support allies. We have to work with the boots on the ground that are being effective, and it's our role to try and make sure they have a chance with their courageous resistance to ISIS to actually be successful in pushing this monster back.
Allan, the international coalition work, the airstrike approach, do you think that's enough? What's it going to take to really stop this here?
Well, I think the hope is that if you can actually take out the top leadership and hit strategic points through an airstrike, that will stop ISIL in its tracks, and I think that's the aspiration. The problem, of course, are twofold. Is that enough? And is it possible that, yes, you could wipe out the very top leadership today, but as we were talking about earlier, it could be also the leadership can be filled in by others. And also, this is a very, again, one should emphasize, this is the commanders here have some professional expertise here in terms of how to engage in a war and that sort of thing. So the problem here is that can we do everything strictly through air commitments within that 6-month period? That's our aspiration, that's our hope. Frankly, I hope it works. But the problem is that, of course, even if you are able to control some of the areas there, you have to do the follow-up. Sooner or later, somewhere along the line, there has to be some either troops or we hope advisors are enough to help the Iraqi army to get back on track and retain sovereignty over the area of Iraq. And similar, the problem here now may be Syria too, because eastern part of Syria, it's a basket case right now, and who's in charge? And again, we have to have some sort of follow through there. Can we do all of that in 6 months? I think that's where we simply don't know. And of course, the big challenge here, I did notice that when Parliament voted, it voted for commitment to airstrikes now, and that's the green light that's been given to the government. But right now, coupled with that is the resolution that there are not to be troops in combat right now, and that was a strong point. Somewhere along the line, if we don't achieve those targets by April, we may actually have to have a full engaged public discussion in Canada as to what is our commitment in terms of boots on the ground, as we use that phrase. And President Obama will be now, the American elections, midterm elections are over. Now, President Obama has a lot of flexibility to do whatever he wants. And to some extent, he provides the lead here as to how the Americans will respond to what is happening there. And if suddenly President Obama turns around 180 degrees because he's no longer up for re-election and says, no, we have to follow this through with troops and have troops engaged to preserve the area in Syria and but especially Iraq, then that's going to put pressure on us.
Is Canada's role in this, James, is it linked to what the Americans decide to do? I mean, it was just the scenario where Canada is involved militarily beyond the 6 months. If the Americans have a severely reduced role, I don't really see it. But is that, I mean, how much of a factor does what America does compared to what? How does that affect what Canada does here?
Well, I think the U.S., let me say it this way, whenever the U.S. is perceived to be weak, it leads to adventurism in other parts of the world. You know, with a comment like that as a background, I think the fact that it was a political decision to pull the troops out when they did a few years back out of America's, you know, the public support for a long campaign and heavy casualties in Iraq.
I think we'd all agree with that.
You know, their public support was at a low ebb. It was a political decision to pull the troops out with the Iraqi forces that we worked hard to train. I'm sorry, we were in Afghanistan, but the Americans had worked hard to train troops in Iraq to be able to take on the opponents, the threats that were there. And, you know, this kind of an insurgency takes a long time to build up competent forces to resist them. So anyway, where we're at now is, I heard a remarkable statement from the Secretary of State recently that if the U.S. failed to contain ISIS, that perhaps Iran and Syria could take the lead in combating ISIS, or ISIL, if you will. And, you know, frankly, in that world, America, remarks like that has shown itself to be a non-player. In a sense, that's a very, very serious thing, because America is still the largest military power in the world and the leader in terms of controlling this kind of terrible evil, frankly, and now very well-equipped evil with very serious arms acquirement. And frankly, the thing that's even more troubling is that is the possibility that ISIS now has chemical weapons. And that's a prospect that has been raised recently because Syria was supposed to have got rid of its chemical weapons. We all saw that playing out, but there is evidence that he did not get rid of all of his weapons, and some of them have fallen into the hands of ISIS and have been used already in the campaign in Kobani and other places, chlorine gas, and there's evidence they may well have more other agents as well.
Got to get a quick break in here. Our last segment's on the threat of the Islamic State extremists up next here on Head On Shaw TV. Ian Holmes back on Head On here on Shaw TV with MP James Lunney representing Nanaimo, Alberni, also political commentator Allan Warnke here in our Shaw TV studios discussing the threat of the Islamic State extremists in Iraq, also Syria, and it's caused some grave concern as the Canadian government has voted to go in for a combat mission, a 6-month commitment so far. Gentlemen, let's move on to the threat of homegrown terror, and we've started to see that happen here recently. And Allan, we had a phone conversation a couple months ago where you predicted there could be some acts of violence here in Canada connected to terror, and in this instance, James, it looks like men in uniform have been attacked. How much of it is this linked to this conflict happening right now in Iraq and Syria? It seems to be there's some form of a link there. What's your read into what's happened on our own soil here of late?
Well, it's unquestionable there's a link to both the attacks in Saint-Jean with Vincent Patrice and also the one in Ottawa with Michael Bibo. Both of them influenced with this Islamic fervor, if you will, and by the ISIL mentality. So it is a very serious concern. We have at least 3 pieces of legislation recently have been changed to help combat terrorism. One has to do with passports, with Citizenship Act, with dual citizens, to take passports away. Another is against online recruitment techniques, because a lot of the servers are in Western countries, so we want to be able to deal with recruitment and incitement through websites that Western countries are hosting the servers. And the final one is just introduced in late April to do with the powers, anti-terrorism powers, to intercept and shut down some of these, online hatred and so on. So we're taking measures to try and protect Canadians at home, but there's at least 130 Canadians, people with Canadian links, who are known to have participated or gone over to participate, suspected of participating in these ISIL attacks around the Middle East, and some have come home wounded and so on.
How legitimate are these terrorist attacks, perhaps linked, as James is insinuating here, the link with what's happening right now with these Islamic extremists? You predicted this a couple months ago in a news story we did on 106.9 The Wolf and 102.3 The Wave. Allan, this is something you sort of first saw a couple of months ago.
Well, it would be in response to what Parliament does, and this is exactly what happens, is that when Parliament essentially they gave the green light essentially to conduct airstrikes and that sort of thing. There was an interesting statement by the official spokesman for ISIL that now Canada is one of your targets. And as a matter of fact, went so far as to say that every Canadian should be worried about their own bedroom from here on out. And actually, to some extent, that would be the reaction once Canada is on the radar screen of ISIL. That's what's happened here. Now, in terms of the two events that James was referring to on October 20th and 22nd, here's the tricky part. I think to some extent there is a linkage insofar as that obviously the two terrorists that went after soldiers, they were inspired by ISIL in one form or another through internet, but were they rogue operations or were they part of something else? We don't really know, but we do know this, is that there's a heck of a lot of chatter out there. And so if these are two rogue operations, then we still should be concerned. We should be still quite concerned because there's still a lot of chatter out there. In other words, is there possibility here of more acts?
We're going to shift on to our last topic here, gentlemen, New Age terrorism, and you talked a little bit about the online element and the Canadian government looking for legislation to try to reduce that recruiting tool, if you will, to have these terrorists grow their organizations that way. Allan, I know you have quite a few thoughts on that. James, we'll get to you in a moment on that element, on how social media is really being leveraged by a lot of terrorist groups to grow their base.
Yes, we've thought all along for, I suppose, several years that social media is a way to link various youth throughout the world. And in fact, President Obama said it in his statement to Cairo University in June of 2009 of how Kansas and Cairo could be linked, how the youth of those two regions can be linked through social media and so on. We've been very optimistic that social media is the basis for perhaps maybe regime changes and that sort of thing. But the opposite is true. Social media can be used against us as well as for us.
That's the interesting aspect. There's positives and negatives for technology with the online realm and social media. James, what is your opinion on that?
Well, I think about lone wolf, small groups, not communicating. It's one thing about the West that always strikes me as odd. We have to telegraph exactly how we caught the guys, and we tell them, how we track their activities and their communications and so on. So they're smart, they're listening to, and they change their tactics. And I know we had an agent from the U.S., many years a CIA operative in Ottawa recently, explaining that their community is extremely concerned about penetration of Islamic activists at the highest levels of the U.S. administration and defense establishment. And, we have attacks like what took place at Fort Hood with a psychiatrist who killed some 13 members on the largest military base in the United States, and they don't want to call it a terrorist attack. That's a concern.
Gentlemen, we're flat out of time. This half hour just whipped by. I think it was very informative, and I hope our viewers took something about Canada's involvement, learned a little bit more about these Islamic State extremists. Guys, thanks for providing some context and some analysis. I really appreciate that. Allan Warnke, VIU, now retired political science professor, but now a very active political commentator. Allan, thanks for coming in. And also James Lunney, MP for Nanaimo, Alberni. Guys, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Pleasure.
Our pleasure, yes.
That's another one in the books. Head on here on Shaw TV, delving into the issues that really matter here on Mid-Vancouver Island. I'm Holmes. We'll talk to you next time.